The snow fell gently, blanketing the quiet, cold streets with a layer of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The world seemed frozen in time. In the midst of this serene winter landscape, a small boy stood alone, his dark skin contrasting against the snowy backdrop. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he stared at the untouched snow at his feet. He had never known the warmth of a real family, at least, not in the way most children do. No gentle hands to hold him, no voice to comfort him after a long, tiring day. No one who would come running when he needed love the most. But today, something was different. Today, he was going to build the one thing that could make him feel a little less alone, a snowman. This boy, who had spent most of his life fighting through the cold loneliness of foster homes and empty streets, wasn't just building a snowman. He was building a dream of a family, of a place where he could belong, where he could finally find a sense of peace. As his small hands packed the snow together, shaping it carefully, he imagined the snowman not just as a winter decoration, but as a symbol of hope. It wasn't much, just a few large snowballs stacked one on top of the other, 2 small stones for eyes, and a carrot for a nose. But for him, it was everything. With each scoop of snow, his heart grew lighter. The world seemed less bleak, less cold. He was lost in his work, so focused that he didn't hear the sound of tires crunching the snow in the distance. He didn't notice the small car slowly making its way down the road until it stopped right in front of him. The boy stood up straight, brushing the snow from his hands. The car door opened, and out stepped a man, a stranger, who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and warmth in his eyes. The boy didn't know what to think. He wasn't used to kindness. His experience had taught him to be wary of people, to guard his heart. The man smiled, and the boy felt a strange tug in his chest. "That's quite the snowman you've made there," the man said, his voice friendly but gentle, as if speaking to a child who had been waiting for a kind word for a long time. The boy's eyes flickered to the snowman and then back to the stranger, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to talking to strangers. But something in the man's eyes, something warm and genuine, made him hesitate. "Yeah," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's my family." He immediately regretted the words, but it was too late. The man's expression softened, and for a moment, the boy felt a weight in his chest. He was afraid of being vulnerable, of revealing too much of himself to someone who might not care. But the man simply nodded, as if he understood more than words could ever say. "I see," the man said quietly, glancing at the snowman again, his gaze lingering on it for a moment. "A snowman can be the best kind of company when you don't have anyone else, can't it?" The boy blinked, his throat tight. He wasn't sure why, but those words felt like they carried a deeper meaning than just the snowman. As if they were speaking to something inside him that had been buried for so long, something he had almost forgotten how to feel, hope. The man's eyes studied the boy for a moment, and in that brief silence, something passed between them. The boy wasn't sure what it was, he couldn't put it into words, but for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Not just as a boy alone in the snow, but as someone who mattered. "Why don't you come with me?" the man asked softly, his tone kind and genuine. "You don't have to be alone out here. You deserve more than this. You deserve to be with people who care about you." The boy's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. Could it be true? Could someone actually want him, really want him, for the first time in his life? The snowman was just a symbol, a creation to ease the ache inside him. But what if it wasn't just a dream anymore? What if, for once, he didn't have to pretend to be strong? What if, just this once, he could let someone else take the lead? The boy swallowed hard, staring at the man, trying to gauge if he could trust him. He'd been hurt before, abandoned before. But there was something in the man's eyes that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I don't know, the boy said, his voice shaky. The idea of leaving everything he had ever known was terrifying. But at the same time, there was a spark inside him, a flicker of hope he couldn't quite extinguish. He had spent so many years wishing for a family, for a place where he could belong. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? The man gave him a gentle smile, as if he understood the boy's hesitation. Take your time, he said. No rush. But just know that there are people who care. You don't have to keep going it alone. The boy looked back at the snowman, then up at the man. The world seemed to stretch out before him, uncertain and vast. The snowflakes continued to fall, quietly coating everything in a soft, white silence. But for the first time in his life, the boy felt the smallest spark of something else, something that had been missing for so long: hope. But what would he do next? Would he take a chance on this stranger, on this possibility that life could be different? Or would he walk away, keeping his heart guarded, afraid of getting hurt again? The man's voice broke through his thoughts. Come on, kid. You deserve a chance at happiness. Don't you think? The boy stared at him, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Could he trust the kindness he saw in the man's eyes? Could he dare to believe in a family, in a future he had only ever dreamed of? As the snow fell softly around them, the boy felt his heart race. The world was waiting. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered, was this his chance? The boy stood frozen, caught between the fear of the unknown and the yearning for something more than the life he had always known. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. What if this man was like all the others who had let him down? What if this was just another false promise, another broken dream? But then, as the snow continued to fall, something shifted inside him. He thought about all the nights he had spent in dark, empty rooms, wishing for the warmth of a family, for the security of belonging somewhere. He thought about how many times he had tried to build something out of nothing, just like he was building the snowman now. A snowman wasn't much, but it was something. Something he had made with his own hands, something that represented his hope. Could this man offer him something more than just fleeting kindness? Was there a real chance that he could finally find the family he had always dreamed of? The boy's eyes flicked from the snowman to the man's kind face, and for the first time, he felt the flicker of hope burn just a little brighter. He took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of snow underfoot loud in the quiet of the winter landscape. The man's smile widened slightly, as if he could sense the boy's internal battle. No pressure, kid, the man said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. I know it's a big decision. But I want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you choose, you matter. The boy swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, as though something had lodged in it, something that had been buried deep for so long. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, how much he had longed for someone to simply say that he mattered. Taking another step, he looked up at the man, meeting his gaze. What if it's a mistake? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I get hurt again? The man knelt down to the boy's level, looking him in the eyes with a steady, kind gaze. I can't promise everything will be perfect. Life isn't perfect. But I can promise you that you won't have to face it alone. And I can promise you that we'll take it one step at a time. No one's ever really ready for a big change, but sometimes, the biggest changes bring the most surprising things. The boy's chest tightened, and he felt his heart racing. The snow around him seemed to swirl, the cold air biting at his skin, but in that moment, the warmth of the man's words surrounded him like a blanket. He felt something inside him begin to melt, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart, the ones he had used to protect himself from hurt, from rejection, from disappointment, began to crack. I don't want to be alone anymore, the boy admitted, his voice small but strong. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, unsure of what would happen next. He had always been told to fend for himself, to rely only on his own strength. But now, for the first time, he wondered if there was room for him to trust someone else. Was there room for him to finally be a part of something? The man's expression softened, and he held out a hand to the boy. "You don't have to be," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You've got a place now, a chance to be part of something real. Just take my hand, and we'll figure it out together." The boy hesitated, his gaze flicking from the outstretched hand to the snowman he had built, a symbol of his dreams, of his hope. For so long, he had believed that he could make it on his own, that he didn't need anyone else. But now, as the man stood before him, offering something he had only dreamed of, the boy felt the weight of years of loneliness lift just slightly. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took the man's, feeling a surge of something he hadn't felt in so long, hope. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be perfect, but it was a promise that he didn't have to face the world alone anymore. The man stood, gently pulling the boy to his feet. "There's so much more waiting for you," the man said, his voice low but full of promise. "A family, a home, people who will care for you. This is just the beginning." The boy nodded, still uncertain but feeling a strange sense of peace. He had taken the first step into a new world, a world where he wasn't just a shadow in the snow, a world where he could be seen and valued. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be hurdles to overcome, fears to face, and doubts to silence. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. For the first time, he felt like there was a chance. As the man guided him toward the car, the boy glanced over his shoulder at the snowman he had built. It stood there, silent and unmoving, but somehow it felt less important now. It had been a dream he built alone, but now he had something real. Something he could hold on to. The snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny piece of a bigger story, a story of a boy who had built something out of nothing, and found that, sometimes, the most unexpected moments can change everything. As the boy and the man drove off into the unknown, the boy couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would he find the family he had always dreamed of? Would he finally feel the love and acceptance he had craved for so long? For now, the answers were unknown, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter where he no longer had to build his dreams alone. And for the first time, that thought filled him with a sense of hope he never thought he'd feel again. The car hummed quietly as they drove down the winding road, the boy staring out the window, lost in thought. The world outside was still blanketed in snow, the landscape looking almost dreamlike, but his mind was a swirl of questions. What was going to happen now? Where was this man taking him? Could he trust him? The warmth of the man's words still echoed in his head, but the boy couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The man, who hadn't introduced himself yet, kept his eyes on the road. He seemed calm, too calm, as if everything was perfectly normal, as if it wasn't strange for a child to be picked up from the side of a snow-covered street by a stranger. The boy shifted uneasily in his seat. He had been through enough to know that not everything was as it seemed. People could be kind for a while, but then they could change, could leave, could break promises. His life had taught him that much. But as the man glanced at him from time to time, his eyes were filled with kindness. It was hard to deny that there was something genuine in his face, something that made the boy want to believe him. The boy tightened his grip on his jacket sleeves, unsure of how to feel. His heart ached for a family, but he was terrified of being disappointed. The idea of finally having what he had always wanted seemed too good to be true. The man broke the silence. "I'm James, by the way. I should have told you earlier. I know this is all a lot to take in." He offered a gentle smile, but the boy didn't respond immediately. James. The name echoed in the boy's mind, but it didn't mean anything to him. He had no frame of reference for it, no idea what kind of person this James was, or what his intentions were. He only knew what he had seen and heard in the few minutes they had spent together. "You can call me whatever you like," James added, his voice reassuring. "I know you've probably been through a lot, but I want you to know that this isn't like any other place. This is a chance for something new." The boy turned his head slowly to look at him. There was something in James's tone that hinted at a deeper story, one that the boy couldn't quite place. He couldn't help but wonder why a man like James would care about a kid like him. What did he stand to gain from all of this? His life had been shaped by uncertainty, by people who came and went, so trusting someone was a concept that felt foreign. "I don't know if I'm ready," the boy muttered under his breath. What if it's all fake? What if you just leave me like everyone else?" James's eyes softened, and he seemed to take a deep breath before responding. "I understand how hard it must be for you to trust. Trusting people isn't something that happens overnight, especially when you've been hurt before. But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to make a decision right now. But I want you to know that you have a choice now. And that choice is yours to make." The boy looked out the window again, the landscape passing by in a blur of white. A part of him wanted to believe James, to trust that he wasn't just another empty promise. But the other part of him, the part that had spent so many years living with disappointment, was telling him to guard his heart. What if James was just like the others? What if he, too, would eventually disappear when things got difficult? His mind wandered to the orphanages he had lived in, cold, lifeless places where children were left to fend for themselves. Where everything felt temporary, like nothing truly belonged. He had been moved from one home to the next, never staying long enough to build any real connections. The only thing that had remained constant was the ache in his chest, the longing for a family that would never come. The idea of having a real family, of having a place to call home, was something that had always seemed like a far-off fantasy. Something that wasn't meant for him. As the car continued down the road, James turned the corner and pulled into a long driveway. The boy looked up, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. A large house stood in front of him, surrounded by trees that were dusted with snow. It looked almost like something out of a storybook, something that didn't belong in his world. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The house was warm, inviting, like it could hold all the things he had dreamed of: comfort, family, belonging. James parked the car, and the boy sat frozen, staring at the house. It was beautiful, too perfect. Was this real? Was it possible that someone could really offer him this? His heart raced, and a lump formed in his throat. He had seen too many things that seemed good only to fall apart. Could this be his chance to finally find a home, or was it just another illusion? James turned off the engine and opened the door, stepping out into the snow. He glanced back at the boy, who was still sitting motionless in his seat. "You don't have to come inside if you're not ready," James said softly. "But I'd like to show you around. See if this is the place you've been looking for." The boy hesitated. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that this house, this man, could be the family he had always dreamed of. But the fear still gnawed at him, the fear of being let down, the fear of being left alone once again. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit his face, but it didn't feel as harsh as it had before. Something about the warmth of the house in front of him made the cold seem a little more bearable. James led the way to the front door, and the boy followed, his footsteps hesitant but steady. The snow crunched underfoot, the only sound in the quiet of the moment. The door opened with a creak, and the boy was greeted by the warm glow of light spilling out from inside. The scent of something delicious filled the air, food, maybe, or something else that made him feel like he could finally breathe a little easier. The boy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision pressing on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let his guard down. But as he stepped into the house, something inside him stirred. He didn't know if he was making the right choice. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something real. As the door closed behind them, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he was looking for were inside. But he also knew that there was still so much he didn't understand about this strange, new world he had just stepped into. The door closed with a soft thud behind them, and the boy was immediately struck by the warmth of the house. It wasn't just the temperature, there was something else about the place, something that made it feel alive, like it had a heartbeat of its own. It wasn't a mansion, but it had a cozy, inviting quality to it. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and the floors were covered with thick rugs that muffled the sound of their footsteps. As James led him further inside, the boy's eyes darted around the room, taking in the details. There were family portraits hanging on the walls, smiling faces, people who seemed connected, who seemed to belong together. The boy felt a pang of longing, a desire to know what it was like to have that. To have a family who would smile at him like that, to be part of something that felt real. James stopped by the fireplace, where a fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow on the room. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, motioning toward a couch nearby. The boy nodded quietly and moved to sit down, his body stiff with uncertainty. He didn't know if he was ready to let his guard down just yet, but something in James's calm presence made it hard to ignore the possibility of comfort. The warmth of the fire wrapped around him, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the boy felt like he could relax, even if just a little. But the sense of unease didn't go away. His mind was still spinning with thoughts of what might be, what could happen, and what he should do next. James sat down across from him, his gaze thoughtful, but not intrusive. "I know this is a lot for you," he said, breaking the silence. "You've probably never experienced anything like this before. I won't rush you. But I want you to know that you're welcome here, no strings attached." The boy's fingers fidgeted with the hem of his jacket, his eyes cast downward. It was hard to know what to say. He had spent so many years in places where people's kindness always came with conditions. Where nothing ever truly felt like it belonged. This place, was different. But that difference scared him more than he could explain. James must have sensed the boy's hesitation, because he didn't push. Instead, he simply sat quietly, waiting for the boy to speak when he was ready. The soft crackle of the fire filled the space between them, a comforting sound that seemed to remind the boy that things weren't as cold and distant as they had once been. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the boy let his mind wander. He wondered about the people in the portraits on the walls. Were they James's family? Were they real? Or were they just part of a story that the man was trying to create? He had seen it before, people pretending to be what they weren't, creating an image of something perfect that never quite measured up. But there was something about James's eyes, something that made the boy think he was telling the truth. Maybe it was the way he spoke, or maybe it was the way he had cared for the boy when no one else had. Maybe it was that James didn't expect anything in return. That, more than anything, made the boy wonder. After what felt like an eternity, James broke the silence again. "I know this isn't easy, and I don't expect you to make any decisions right away. But I want you to know that this is a safe place. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are here." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry, and he finally lifted his eyes to meet James's. The words hung heavy in the air. A safe place. The boy had heard that phrase before, but it had never really meant anything until now. Could it mean something here? Could this place actually be the home he had been searching for? His mind raced. He wanted to believe James. He wanted to believe that this wasn't just another lie. That maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him to finally belong somewhere. But he had been let down so many times before. The hurt, the rejection, it never stopped stinging. Was this just a cruel trick? Was he setting himself up for more pain? You don't have to decide anything right now, James continued, his voice steady. But I want you to understand that there's a place for you here, whenever you're ready. The boy felt a strange pull inside him, like a part of him wanted to reach out and take a chance, but another part of him recoiled, scared of what it might cost him. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt suffocated by the weight of it all. Then, just as he was about to speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the creak of a door opening. The boy looked up to see a woman walking into the room, her face soft and welcoming. She was smiling, her eyes warm, and there was something about her that felt familiar. She wasn't like anyone the boy had known before, but her presence was calming, like she had been part of something good for a long time. "James," she said, her voice gentle, but there was a strength to it. "I heard we had a visitor." The boy froze, unsure of what to do. He had no idea who she was, but the way she spoke and looked at him made him feel like he wasn't an outsider in this space. "This is Sarah," James said, motioning to the woman. "She's a part of the family here, too. We all look out for each other." The boy didn't know what to say. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind swirling with confusion. Family? He had never had a family like this, people who cared, who wanted to look out for him. It seemed too good to be true. Sarah's smile softened as she knelt down to his level, her gaze kind. "It's nice to meet you," she said. "We're glad you're here. You're safe now. You don't have to worry anymore." The boy's breath hitched, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. But even as that spark ignited, the doubts crept in. Could he really trust this? Could he really let himself believe that this place was different? The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, it felt like everything was hanging by a thread. Would he finally find the family he had always dreamed of, or would this be another painful chapter in a life full of unanswered questions? As James and Sarah exchanged a quiet glance, the boy's eyes flicked nervously between them. The mystery was far from over, and the answers still felt out of reach. The room seemed to hold its breath as the boy stared at Sarah, her kind eyes offering him a glimpse of something he hadn't dared to hope for in years: safety. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to step forward, to finally accept what she was offering. But the walls inside him, built up over a lifetime of disappointment, were hard to tear down. Sarah smiled, but the boy could see a glimmer of concern in her eyes. She didn't push, though. She simply stayed kneeling in front of him, waiting. Her presence felt different from anyone else he had known. There was no rush to fix him, no impatience, only quiet understanding. Yet that very calmness felt alien to him. Was this real? Or was it just another illusion, another game to make him think he had finally found something good? "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked, her voice a little softer now, as if sensing his unease. "I can make something warm to eat. It's not much, but it's all we need." The boy's stomach growled in response, betraying his quiet hesitation. He hadn't eaten much in days, and his body was beginning to feel the weight of that hunger. He nodded slightly, not trusting his voice yet. The thought of food, something simple and comforting, almost made him want to break down. He had long ago learned to survive on scraps and leftovers, but here, in this warm space, the idea of a meal made him feel vulnerable. He wasn't used to being cared for. "Let's get you something," Sarah said, rising to her feet. "James, can you show him where to sit? I'll make us both some dinner." James nodded, his face kind but unreadable. He had said he wanted the boy to feel comfortable, but James had been through his own battles, and the boy knew there were still so many things left unspoken. As Sarah moved into the kitchen, her movements graceful and sure, the boy sat quietly in the living room, the silence pressing down on him. James remained standing by the fireplace, watching the boy with a mixture of concern and understanding. "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to," James said after a few moments, breaking the quiet. "But I want you to know, we've all been through our own struggles. I'm not here to force you to open up. I'm here to give you the space to find your way." The boy looked up, meeting James's gaze. Something in his words resonated deeply, but it was hard to let go of the years of distrust that had shaped him. People didn't just give things for free. There was always a price, always a catch. He had learned that lesson the hard way. And now, in the face of kindness, it was almost harder to trust than if they had been cruel. "I didn't ask for this," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. James didn't react immediately, but after a moment, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the boy's pain. "No one ever does," he said quietly. "But sometimes, we don't have a choice in the matter. Life just throws things at us. All we can do is try to catch them." The boy looked away, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He wanted to believe. He wanted to be able to accept this kindness, but the shadows of his past were too heavy. The boy had never had the chance to be a child. He had been forced to grow up too quickly, learning how to fend for himself in a world that seemed determined to turn its back on him. And now, faced with the possibility of something better, he wasn't sure how to reach out and grasp it. The sound of a knife slicing through vegetables broke through his thoughts, and he glanced toward the kitchen. Sarah's presence felt constant, steady, but the boy couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. She seemed too perfect, too kind, as if there was some secret hidden beneath her calm exterior. He didn't like feeling this way, suspicious of everyone around him, but it was all he knew. People were never what they seemed. And what if Sarah and James weren't who they said they were? What if they were just playing a role to lure him in, to break him down and make him trust them, only to let him down when he least expected it? "Do you have anyone else, besides James?" The boy's question hung in the air, his voice shaky as he tried to focus on anything other than the gnawing unease in his stomach. Sarah didn't look up from her task but paused for a moment, as if considering how to answer. When she finally did, her voice was steady, though the boy could sense an underlying sadness. "There's no one else right now. But we've made a family here, and sometimes, that's all you need. You can make a family out of the people who care about you, no matter where they come from." The boy chewed on her words, not sure what to make of them. A family? Could he be part of something like that? Something real? It felt like a fantasy, something only found in books or movies, not in the world he had grown up in. But Sarah's words had a weight to them, something he couldn't easily dismiss. Still, the idea of belonging, of having people who cared about him, it was so far removed from his experience that it was hard to even imagine it. As Sarah finished preparing dinner, the boy stayed where he was, lost in his thoughts. The tension in the room had shifted, but it hadn't dissipated. He still wasn't sure if he was ready to let his guard down, to take the risk of trusting them. Trust had been broken too many times in the past, and the fear of being hurt again was a constant companion. Sarah returned to the living room with a tray of food, her smile warm but her eyes betraying a trace of concern. She set the food down in front of the boy and sat beside him, watching as he hesitated. "Go ahead," she encouraged softly. "It's not much, but it's good food. I promise you'll like it." The boy's stomach growled again, louder this time, and he gave a small, reluctant smile. He reached for the plate, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the fork. The first bite was simple, but the taste was comforting in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the food, it was the care that had gone into making it. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't invisible, like someone was paying attention to him. But even as he ate, the nagging feeling that something was off lingered in the back of his mind. There were too many unknowns. The kindness was overwhelming, but it was also frightening. What did they want from him? What would happen next? As the meal came to an end, the boy found himself too tired to keep up his walls. He didn't know how much longer he could pretend everything was fine, when in reality, everything felt fragile, like it might break apart at any moment. Sarah stood to clear the plates, but as she turned to leave, she paused and looked at him one last time. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly, her voice filled with something the boy couldn't quite place. The words hung in the air as Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, and the boy was left alone with his thoughts. The tension in the room hadn't been fully lifted, but something had shifted. The possibility of something more, something real, felt closer than it ever had before. But was he ready to take that step? Or would he remain frozen in place, too afraid to trust the family that had appeared out of nowhere? The answer, for now, remained just beyond reach. The boy sat there in the dimming light, the silence pressing in from every corner of the room. His mind buzzed with questions, his thoughts darting in every direction, none of them landing on any satisfying answers. The warmth from the meal, the kindness from Sarah, it all felt too surreal. He'd spent so long navigating the cold, harsh realities of survival that the gentleness he was experiencing now almost felt like a trap. He stood up, needing to move, to shake off the feeling that if he stayed still for too long, he might fall too deeply into something he couldn't escape. He walked to the window, his eyes searching the snowy landscape outside. The world seemed so still, so peaceful. Snowflakes drifted lazily down from the sky, blanketing the ground in a soft white blanket. It was a stark contrast to the chaos inside his mind. He had been abandoned before, more times than he could count. So many people had promised him safety, only to let him down. How could he trust this? How could he trust anyone? "Everything's fine," he muttered to himself, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. The boy had learned not to believe in good things. He had learned to expect disappointment, to rely only on himself. And now, he was caught in this strange, foreign world where people were offering him care, affection, and safety. It made him feel small and helpless, as if he was losing himself in the face of something he didn't know how to handle. A soft creak echoed from behind him, and the boy tensed, instinctively bracing himself for whatever might come next. It was Sarah, stepping quietly into the room, her eyes scanning his face with a quiet understanding. She didn't ask him to explain his sudden distance, she simply stood there, her presence a silent invitation for him to share whatever he needed, whenever he was ready. "Is it hard?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. The boy didn't turn to face her right away. His eyes remained fixed on the snow-covered ground, watching the way the snowflakes caught the light. It was as if he was hoping the world outside would offer him the answers he couldn't find within. "Yeah," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to believe in something when all you've known is loss." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I know it's not easy. Trust takes time. You don't have to let go of everything all at once. But I want you to know, you're safe here. We're not going anywhere." The boy could feel the weight of her words, and for a moment, he thought he might cry. He had never really understood what it meant to be safe, to have a place where you could just exist without fear. And yet, here it was, right in front of him, so close and yet so far away. "I'm not used to this," he said, finally turning to face her. His words hung in the air between them, raw and unpolished. "I'm not used to people not wanting something from me." Sarah's gaze softened, and she took a step closer. "You don't have to give anything to be here, you know. You just need to be yourself." But the boy shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That's the problem. Who am I? I don't even know anymore. I'm not the kid I used to be. I'm just this. He gestured vaguely to himself, his voice cracking with emotion he didn't want to feel. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew more intense, more focused. She understood. More than anyone else had ever understood. You're not alone anymore, she repeated, her voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to take one step at a time. The boy wanted to believe her, he really did. But a lifetime of walking alone had made him wary of promises. He could feel the walls he had built around himself starting to crack, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to let them fall completely. He wasn't sure if he could survive the vulnerability that would come with it. He glanced out the window again, watching as the night deepened. The world outside seemed as if it could swallow him whole, just like it always had. But inside, in this small house, something else lingered. A strange warmth. A fragile hope. Can I ask you something? The boy said, his voice quieter now. Of course, Sarah replied. What's your story? He asked, turning back to face her fully now. Why are you helping me? Sarah's smile was soft, but her eyes held something deeper. I didn't always have it easy either, she said after a pause. I grew up in a place not too different from where you were. It wasn't always a safe place, but I survived. And one day, I met someone who helped me see that there was more to life than just surviving. That there was a way to live. To really live. She stepped closer, her voice low but filled with sincerity. I want to do the same for you. Because everyone deserves a chance. Everyone deserves to know that they are worth something. The boy's chest tightened as he processed her words. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to be truly seen. To have someone who cared about him without expecting anything in return. But it was so foreign, so unfamiliar, that he immediately pushed the thought away. I don't know if I can believe in that, he said, his voice strained. You don't have to believe it all at once, Sarah replied gently. But I promise, little by little, it will get easier. One step at a time. The boy nodded, but a heavy silence settled over them again. The weight of his past hung around him like a shroud, and the future seemed like a distant dream that he wasn't sure he could ever reach. He wanted to believe in the possibility of a better life, in the promise of something more, but he was afraid. Afraid of hoping, afraid of trusting, and above all, afraid of being let down again. Sarah didn't press him for more, just let him sit with his thoughts. But the tension in the room remained, thick and palpable. There was something else, something unspoken, hanging in the air. The boy didn't know if he could handle the truth when it came. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever the next step might bring. For now, all he could do was wait. The night stretched on, the silence between the boy and Sarah growing heavier with each passing minute. It was as if the world outside had frozen, just as his mind had, caught between hope and fear. He could still feel the warmth of the meal in his belly, the softness of the bed where he had slept, but it was all so new, so alien to him. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Every time he let himself believe, just for a moment, that he could have a future, a real one, something inside him screamed to be cautious. To pull back before it all slipped away. He stood up abruptly, the need to move, to escape the pressure building within him, too overwhelming to ignore. He walked to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah didn't stop him. She didn't say a word, but her eyes never left him, watching him with that quiet concern. He didn't want her pity, didn't want her understanding. He wasn't sure if he even wanted her help. The boy stepped outside into the cold, the bitter chill of the night air biting at his skin. He welcomed the cold, it was a feeling he knew, a sensation he could trust. The snow crunched under his boots, and he looked around, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The world was still the same. No matter how much it seemed to change, no matter how much Sarah wanted to help, he was still the same abandoned boy he had been when he walked in here. He walked further into the yard, his breath coming in short bursts. The snow was deep, the landscape all white and silent, as if the world was holding its breath. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from the house, from the safety that felt like a trap. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more chaotic than the last. What if he wasn't meant to have this? What if this kind of life wasn't for someone like him? Every time he allowed himself to imagine a future, the fear of losing it all gripped him harder. He couldn't let himself believe in the possibility of peace. He couldn't let himself trust. He couldn't let himself need someone. Behind him, the door creaked open. He didn't turn around, he knew it was Sarah. He could feel her presence even without looking. She had followed him, but he didn't want her to. He didn't want anyone to be close. He didn't want anyone to care. "I just need some time," he muttered, his voice rough with the turmoil inside. "Time to figure this out." "I know," Sarah's voice was calm, gentle, almost like a whisper against the howling wind. "But you don't have to do it alone." He felt the weight of her words more than he wanted to. Alone. That word. He had been alone for so long, for as long as he could remember. The thought of having someone who genuinely cared felt too big, too overwhelming. His chest tightened, his breath coming faster, more shallow. "I don't know how to do this," he said, turning to face her, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. I don't know how to believe that it's real. How do I know this won't just end?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, and he could hear her take a slow step forward. The wind howled around them, but it couldn't drown out the beating of his heart. Her words finally came, softer, but more determined. "Because you're worth it. Because you deserve to have someone who cares." Her words cut through the storm inside him, but they also made the walls he had so carefully constructed feel fragile, like they could fall apart with the smallest touch. He wanted to run again, to pull away from it all, but something inside him hesitated. Something told him to stay, to face the possibility, even if it terrified him. He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to hold on to the anger, to the fear that had always kept him strong. But the longer he stood there, the more that anger began to crumble. Something else was trying to rise to the surface, something softer, something that scared him even more than the darkness he had known for so long. A loud crack of thunder broke the tension in the air, and for a split second, the boy froze. He looked up, his heart pounding. The sky had darkened suddenly, clouds swirling overhead in a violent dance. The storm wasn't just on the ground, it was coming from the heavens themselves. The wind began to pick up again, fierce and howling, as if nature itself was reflecting the chaos inside him. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "Come inside. It's not safe out here." But the boy didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at the swirling sky above him, feeling the ground beneath his feet shift as if it might swallow him whole. The weight of everything he had been carrying, all the years of abandonment, all the pain, seemed to converge in that one moment. His hands trembled, his mind racing. The storm was growing stronger, the wind howling, and something deep inside him broke. He wasn't sure if it was his own heart or the world itself shattering around him. He looked back at Sarah, his voice hoarse. "I can't do this. I don't know how to be normal. I don't know how to trust you." "I know," Sarah whispered, her eyes softening, but her voice strong. "But I'm not going anywhere." The storm was relentless now, the snow swirling in furious gusts, but the boy didn't move. He felt the pull of something. Something he couldn't explain, something deep inside him that said it was time to stop running. To stop hiding. He was terrified. Terrified of failing, terrified of being hurt again. But in the face of this storm, there was another kind of storm rising within him, one that he couldn't ignore. And as the wind howled louder, he took a step towards Sarah. It wasn't much, just one small step, but it felt like everything. In that moment, everything changed. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, the tension hanging heavy. The boy didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how this would all play out. But for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, he could have the family he always dreamed of. As he stood there, the biting cold of the wind stinging his face, the boy's chest heaved with uncertainty. The storm raged on around him, but there was a small flicker of warmth growing inside him, a flicker he had buried so deep for so long. The possibility that Sarah wasn't just a kind stranger, that she might actually be someone he could trust, someone who genuinely cared. That thought, so fragile and new, seemed almost too much to handle. But he couldn't deny it. The pull was real. He glanced at Sarah, who stood a few steps away, her face soft yet resolute. The storm seemed to subside in the space between them. Sarah's eyes were filled with something the boy hadn't seen in years, hope. Real hope. The kind of hope that made the world feel less heavy, less cold. Sarah, his voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She took another step closer, never pushing him, just letting him find his own way, his own pace. She didn't speak, but her presence spoke louder than any words could. She was here. She was real. And that, for some reason, was enough to stop him from running, even though every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to go back to the cold, lonely world he knew. The boy swallowed hard, his throat tight. What if this is all just a dream? What if I wake up, and none of this is real? Sarah reached out slowly, her hand hovering just inches from his. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to convince him with more words. She simply let her hand fall gently onto his arm, a gesture that, for a moment, grounded him. For the first time, he felt a small sense of connection, real, tangible, and full of the warmth he had longed for. "You're not dreaming," Sarah said softly, her voice steady and calm, like a lighthouse in a storm. "I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." He let out a long breath, unsure of what to do next. The doubts still swirled in his mind like the storm around them, but there was something in Sarah's eyes, something he hadn't seen before, that made him hesitate. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It wasn't the false kind of kindness people sometimes gave because they felt obligated. It was something pure, something genuine. The way she looked at him made him feel seen, not just as the boy who had been abandoned, but as someone worthy of care, someone who deserved to be loved. His hand twitched at his side, and for a fleeting moment, he wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them, to feel that warmth for just a little longer. But the fear crept back, colder than the wind howling around them. He took a small step back, the fear tightening its grip again. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible against the wind. "I've been on my own for so long. I don't know how to let someone in." Sarah's gaze softened even more, if that was possible, and she took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "You don't have to know everything right now. You don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take one step at a time, and know that you're not alone." Her words seemed to cut through the chaos in his mind, pulling him back from the edge. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them, how much he needed to know that there was a chance, however small, that he could find something more than the cold emptiness that had filled his life. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do with all the emotions rushing through him. The storm still raged above them, but in this moment, it felt like the world had shifted. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not if he didn't want to be. The boy exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold night air. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in something beyond the walls he had built around his heart. Maybe there was hope. Maybe there was a way out of this dark, lonely existence. Maybe, just maybe, he could be a part of something more. "I don't know what this is," he said quietly, his voice still uncertain but softer now. "But, maybe I'm ready to try." Sarah smiled then, and it was a smile so warm, so genuine, that it made his heart skip a beat. Without another word, she reached out, gently pulling him back toward the house, toward the warmth, toward the possibility of a future he had never dared to imagine. As they walked together, side by side, the snow falling softly around them, the boy felt a shift deep within him. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the fear was still there, lingering like a shadow. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to build something worth holding on to. Something that could withstand the storm. And as they reached the door, Sarah glanced at him, her smile lingering. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time." The boy nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "One day at a time," he repeated, a small, tentative hope beginning to bloom inside him. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the boy felt the weight of the world shift ever so slightly. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't feel quite so afraid of it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The warmth inside the house was like a distant memory to the boy as he stood in the hallway, his hand still hovering near the door. It was quieter here, almost too quiet. Sarah had gone off to check on something in the kitchen, leaving him standing there, surrounded by unfamiliar things. The house wasn't large, but it felt like a palace to him, full of light, warmth, and possibilities he had never dared to dream about. Yet, despite the comfort, there was still that nagging sense of uncertainty deep in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was, but something didn't sit right. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the family portraits hanging on the walls. Each one showed a smiling, happy family, the kind of family he had always imagined but never had. They were everything he had ever wanted, and yet the feeling gnawed at him, like he was somehow intruding, like he didn't belong. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Sarah reappeared, a warm smile still on her face, but her eyes were different now, sharper, more calculating. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, but the way she said it made him feel like she was asking something deeper than just his mood. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze flickered to the staircase, and for a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Something had changed in the air. It felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. He looked at Sarah, her face unreadable now, and a flicker of doubt crept in. What was she really hiding? Was this all a dream he was walking through, or was something far darker waiting around the corner? Before he could speak, the doorbell rang. A sharp, unexpected sound that cut through the tension. His heart raced. He could feel the dread creeping in once more. Who could it be at this hour? Sarah's smile faltered just a little, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, a flash of hesitation in her eyes. "I'll get it," Sarah said quickly, but her voice was laced with something unfamiliar. She didn't wait for his response before moving toward the door, her steps a little too hurried, too forced. The boy hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but the air around him suddenly felt electric, thick with anticipation. The feeling of being an outsider, of being the unwanted one, was creeping back into his chest. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him after everything that had happened today. The door creaked open, and he heard Sarah speaking to someone, but the words were muffled. He couldn't make out the conversation, but it sounded like she was trying to be calm, trying to reassure whoever it was on the other side. His curiosity got the best of him. He moved closer to the hallway, just out of sight, trying to hear better. The next words he caught sent a chill down his spine. "I told you, he's not ready for this yet." "We need more time." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. The boy's heart raced, the world around him blurring for a moment. More time for what? What was she hiding? His thoughts swirled, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation, but they didn't make sense. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a low, guttural voice from the other side of the door. The boy's breath caught in his throat. Whoever was out there didn't sound friendly. It wasn't just a conversation. There was something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his body frozen in place. What was happening? Who was out there, and why did it feel like the life he had just started to imagine was slipping through his fingers? The door slammed shut with a sudden force, making the boy jump. Sarah was back, but her face had changed completely. The warmth, the kindness, it was gone. Replaced by something colder, harder. "You need to stay here," she said, her voice low and steady, the words hanging in the air like a warning. "What's going on?" the boy asked, his voice shaking despite himself. "Who was that? What did they want?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand gripping his arm tightly, almost as if she were afraid he might run. "You don't understand," she said, her voice raw now, as if she were holding something back. "There's more to this than you realize. They're not who you think they are." The boy's heart thudded in his chest. "Who are they?" "People I used to know," she said quickly, glancing toward the door, as if making sure they weren't being overheard. "And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. I thought I could protect you from this, but I was wrong. I can't keep you safe anymore." The boy was reeling, his mind struggling to keep up with the words. It felt like everything had shifted in an instant, like he had been swept into a story that he couldn't escape. The warmth of the house, the kindness Sarah had shown him, it was all slipping away, unraveling faster than he could hold on to it. He took a step back, his chest tightening with panic. "What do they want with me?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. Instead, there was a sound from the front yard, a rustling, like footsteps crunching through the snow. It was followed by a voice, distant but growing closer. "Sarah, we know he's here," the voice called, a low, threatening tone in it. "It's time to come out and play." The boy's heart stopped. The storm outside felt like a mere whisper compared to the storm rising in his chest. He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide, the fear in them too raw to hide. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's face hardened. "They're coming for you. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep you hidden." The door to the house creaked, and the sound of shuffling footsteps drew nearer. In that moment, the boy realized the truth, everything had changed. The quiet life he had hoped for, the one he thought he could find here, was slipping through his fingers. And there was no way to stop what was coming next. He had to make a choice. Run. Or face whatever was waiting for him outside. The boy's mind raced as the footsteps grew louder, echoing down the hall like a drumbeat. His breath came faster, shallow, as panic set in. He turned to Sarah, but she was already moving, her expression hardening into something he didn't recognize. The warmth that had once radiated from her seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. "They're here," she said, her voice tight with fear. "You need to go, now." The boy felt his heart thud painfully in his chest. The snowman he had built earlier, the one he thought might somehow lead him to a sense of belonging, now felt like a distant, faded memory. He wasn't just trying to fit into a new family anymore. He was trapped in something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But, where? His voice trembled, but he couldn't stop the question from tumbling out. Where can I go? Sarah's eyes flickered to the window, the dark night outside swallowing the light of the house. There's a cellar, she said urgently, her hand pushing him toward the small, hidden door in the corner of the kitchen. It's not much, but it's safe for now. Get down there, and don't come out until I say it's okay. The boy's mind was spinning. Safe? Safe from what? From who? His legs felt like they were made of lead as he stumbled toward the cellar door, Sarah's grip never loosening from his arm. She opened it with a quiet click, revealing a dark, cold space beneath the house. The boy's eyes darted around the room, his thoughts racing. The cellar was small, cramped, and smelled musty. There were boxes stacked along the walls and an old furnace in the corner. It was a far cry from the warmth and comfort he had imagined, but he had no choice. With one last glance at Sarah, who was standing frozen in the doorway, the boy stepped down into the darkness. The moment his foot touched the bottom step, he heard the front door open with a creak. His heart skipped a beat as voices flooded the house. You know where he is, don't you? The voice sounded colder, more threatening than before. I haven't seen him. Sarah's voice was shaky, and for the first time, the boy noticed the fear beneath her words. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear of these people, fear of what they might do if they didn't find him. The boy pressed himself back against the cold stone walls of the cellar, his body trembling. He wanted to move, to do something, but all he could do was listen to the voices upstairs, his thoughts spiraling. What had Sarah meant when she said they were coming for him? Who were these people? And why did they want him so badly? His hand clenched into a fist as he stood there in the dark, waiting. He didn't know how long he had been down there, minutes? Hours? Time seemed to blur as the sounds from above continued to swirl in and out of his consciousness. Then, the door to the cellar creaked. The boy's heart stopped. He didn't move, his breath caught in his throat. Was it Sarah coming to tell him it was safe? Or had they found him? The door creaked again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Someone had entered. The boy's eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from the small crack in the door, and he saw a shadow moving. The figure was tall, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were searching. The boy's heart hammered in his chest as he silently prayed they wouldn't find him. Footsteps echoed in the small space above him, then paused. The silence that followed was so thick the boy thought he might suffocate in it. Then, a low voice broke the stillness. You know he's here, don't you? The voice was smooth, almost too calm. But there was an edge to it, a dangerous promise that made the boy's skin crawl. Sarah's voice cracked as she responded, I don't know where he is, please, just leave him alone. Another step. The sound of something heavy shifting above him. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He was sure they could hear him. Sure they could sense his presence. The shadow above the cellar door moved closer, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The boy pressed himself harder into the corner, hoping the darkness would hide him, praying he wouldn't be found. Then, there was a sudden crash. The door to the cellar was flung open with a violent force. The boy's heart stopped as cold air rushed into the room. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and imposing, his face partially obscured by a dark hood. His eyes gleamed coldly as they scanned the room, landing on the boy. You can't hide forever, the man said, his voice deep and chilling. The boy didn't move, too afraid to even breathe. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in place. The tension in the air was thick, like the boy was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. His mind raced, he had no idea who this man was or what he wanted. But in the back of his mind, a horrible thought began to form, these people weren't just looking for him. They were after something else, something that had to do with him, something he didn't understand. Where is he? The man's voice was now harsh, demanding. I know you're hiding him, Sarah. Don't think I won't find him. The boy's chest tightened with fear as Sarah's voice trembled. Please. I don't know. I don't know where he is. The man's gaze snapped back to the boy, his eyes narrowing, as if sensing something was off. The tension was unbearable, and the boy knew that this moment right here, was where everything would change. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the boy. The boy knew he had seconds, maybe less, to make a choice, to act before the man reached him. But he couldn't move. His body refused to respond. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind the man with a deafening bang. A cold silence followed. The boy's heart pounded in his ears, the fear and confusion overwhelming him. What just happened? Was it Sarah? Was it someone else? He didn't know. He couldn't know. All he knew was this: something was coming for him, and there was no place left to hide. The boy stood frozen, his mind reeling from the events that had unfolded in mere moments. The darkness of the cellar closed in around him like a suffocating fog, his pulse echoing in his ears as he tried to make sense of the situation. His eyes flickered to the door, still ajar, the faintest sliver of light from the hallway spilling into the otherwise black room. He could hear faint murmurs from above, but they were muffled now, like the voices of people arguing from a distant world. But it wasn't just the voices that sent a chill down his spine, it was the certainty that he wasn't alone in the cellar anymore. The heavy footsteps above him had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The tension in the air was palpable, and the boy's instincts screamed for him to move. To hide. But there was nowhere left to go. Nowhere safe. He could feel the eyes of that man still burning into him, as though they were watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was as though the world itself had turned against him, twisting into something dark and dangerous. Suddenly, the door to the cellar creaked again, and the boy's breath caught in his throat. This time, the door didn't open, there was no rush of cold air or clattering footsteps. Instead, there was a soft voice, barely above a whisper, as if coming from someone who wasn't entirely sure whether they should be speaking at all. Don't move. It was Sarah. The boy's heart fluttered with a mixture of relief and confusion. She sounded terrified, her voice cracking as if she were caught between the need to protect him and the overwhelming fear of what was happening around them. He hesitated, unsure whether to trust her, but then he heard the faintest shuffle of footsteps, and Sarah appeared in the dim light, her silhouette barely visible in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She looked over her shoulder nervously before stepping inside, quietly shutting the door behind her. Sarah, what's going on? The boy's voice trembled with anxiety. What's happening? Who are those people? Sarah took a deep breath and stepped closer to him. She didn't speak immediately, her eyes darting nervously to the top of the stairs. I don't know how much longer we have, she whispered, her voice low and frantic. But you need to listen carefully. The boy felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What's going on, Sarah? What did they mean? Who are they looking for? For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to answer. Then, with a sudden, resigned sigh, she looked at him, her face a mix of sorrow and fear. They're not just looking for you, she said softly. They're after something much bigger. Something that has to do with your past. The boy blinked, trying to process the words. My past? But I don't you see? Sarah's voice became more urgent. It's not just about you being here with us. You don't remember, but your family, your real family, they were part of something. Something dangerous. And now they've come for you. The boy's mind spun. His memories were foggy, hazy. His past, everything before Sarah and the Snowman, felt like a blur. Had his real family been involved in something dangerous? And what did these people want with him? Sarah. What do you mean? He struggled to keep his voice steady, trying to make sense of the growing storm in his chest. What happened to my family? She opened her mouth to speak, but before any words could leave her lips, the door to the cellar rattled violently. The boy's heart skipped a beat, and he spun toward it, eyes wide with terror. They hadn't been discovered yet, had they? Sarah, he whispered harshly. What do we do? She grabbed his arm and pulled him further back into the shadows of the cellar, her grip firm despite the tremble in her hands. Shoo, don't make a sound, she urged, her voice barely audible. The door rattled again, this time louder, and then a voice, deep and unmistakable, called from above. Sarah! You know where he is. Don't lie to me. It was the man. The same one who had found them earlier. The boy's chest tightened, and his breath became shallow as he tried to make himself as small as possible, hoping the darkness would swallow him whole. Sarah's face had gone ashen, and she looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. I don't know what to do, she whispered frantically. I didn't expect them to find us so soon. They're getting closer. The boy's mind raced. This was it, the moment where everything they had worked for, everything they had tried to build, might come crashing down. But even as fear gripped him, another thought surged forward, a desperate, almost reckless hope. What if I go outside? He asked quietly. What if I run? Maybe I can. No! Sarah's whisper was sharp, too sharp, and the boy flinched at the intensity of it. You can't. You'll be caught. You don't know who they are. They'll hurt you, please, please don't do it. The boy looked at her, his heart thumping in his chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he stay here in the dark, trapped like an animal? Or could he take a chance, run, escape, find a way to make it out? He didn't know what was worse, staying hidden or taking a leap into the unknown. The rattling at the door grew louder, the man's voice becoming more frantic. Sarah! I won't ask again. Where is he? It was now or never. With a last, desperate glance at Sarah, the boy turned and bolted for the small window at the far end of the cellar, his heart pounding in his ears. The sound of his own footsteps echoed like thunder as he sprinted, his mind only focused on one thing, escape. But as his fingers grazed the cold window pane, he heard the unmistakable sound of boots on the stairs, growing louder by the second. There was no time. And then, a noise from behind him, a voice, cut through the silence. It was Sarah. Don't, but before she could finish her warning, the door slammed open once again, and the boy knew he had only moments before everything changed. The boy's heart slammed against his chest as he leapt toward the window. His hands shook with panic as he gripped the cold, brittle frame. The door creaked open behind him, and he could hear the man's heavy breathing, the footsteps growing closer. He was so close to escaping, so close to freedom, but the seconds felt like hours. In that moment, Sarah's voice pierced the tension. You can't outrun them, they'll catch you. Her words hit him like a wave, but it was too late to stop now. His fingers found the latch, and with one swift motion, he pushed the window open. Fresh, cold air flooded the room, and for a fleeting second, the boy thought he could actually feel the freedom on the other side of that glass. But just as he was about to climb through, a strong hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him back with such force that he stumbled. No, he shouted, but his voice was lost in the overwhelming sound of chaos erupting around him. The man had caught him. He felt the cold, steady grip tighten, and for a moment, he feared that he was done. That everything he had fought for, everything Sarah had risked to protect him, was in vain. But then, in the blur of confusion, the most unexpected thing happened. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah move swiftly, her face set in determination. She grabbed a nearby metal pipe that had been discarded on the floor and swung it at the man, catching him off guard. The man grunted as the pipe made contact with his side, but his grip on the boy didn't falter. "Sarah, no," the boy cried, his voice laced with fear and disbelief. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She swung the pipe again, this time with more force, until it finally knocked the man off balance. The boy took a deep breath, the fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew this was their only chance. He pulled away from the man's grip and bolted toward the window, scrambling through the opening with desperate urgency. He didn't stop to look back. He didn't stop to check if Sarah was behind him. He couldn't, he had to keep running. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran through the cold night, the wind biting at his skin. He could hear the man's voice behind him, shouting for him to stop, but the boy didn't falter. His mind was focused on one thing, survival. But just as the boy thought he had outrun the danger, he saw something that made his heart drop. In the distance, coming toward him, were headlights, two large, blinding lights that grew brighter and brighter with each passing second. A car, fast approaching. It was them again. They hadn't given up. They were still after him. With every ounce of strength left in him, the boy pushed himself harder, running faster than he ever had before. His legs burned, but he didn't care. He couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. But as the car drew closer, the boy felt something strange. He felt safe. It was as if the world itself had shifted, and the weight of everything he had been running from suddenly lifted. The headlights of the car were no longer threatening, they were guiding him. And then, just as the car screeched to a halt in front of him, the driver's side door opened. The boy froze. Was this the end? Was this the moment where they finally caught him? But then, a familiar voice called out, one that sent a wave of disbelief washing over him. "Get in, quick!" The boy's eyes widened as he recognized the voice. It was a voice from his past, his real family. His mother. His father. The ones he had thought were lost forever. He hesitated for only a moment before diving into the car, slamming the door behind him. As the engine roared to life, the boy looked out the window and saw the shadowy figures of the men in pursuit, their faces filled with rage. The car sped off into the night, the headlights illuminating the road ahead. And in that moment, the boy realized the truth, the family he had always dreamed of, the family he had thought was lost, was finally here. But just as the tension started to ease, something unexpected happened. His mother turned to him, her face as calm as ever, but there was a glint in her eyes that made the boy's heart skip a beat. "We've been waiting for you," she said softly. "But we didn't think it would be like this." The boy's chest tightened as he tried to process her words. "What do you mean?" His father's voice came from the front, his tone cold and sharp. "You think you're free now? You think you've escaped them? They'll never stop coming for you." The boy stared at them, the weight of their words sinking in. He had thought this was the end of the chase, but now he realized it was only the beginning. The danger wasn't over. His past, the mystery of his family, the things he didn't remember, were still out there, still waiting to consume him. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, the car veered off the road, sharply turning into a dense forest. The boy's heart pounded as he glanced at his parents, but neither of them seemed fazed. "Where are we going?" the boy asked, panic rising in his chest. "Home," his father answered, his voice dark. "It's time you knew the truth." The car sped deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them. The boy's pulse raced, his mind swirling with questions, but one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. And as the car disappeared into the shadows of the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far darker than he ever imagined. The twist wasn't just that his family was alive, it was that everything he thought he knew about them, about himself, was a lie. And the truth? It was waiting for him, just up ahead, in the heart of the forest. The car rumbled over the uneven terrain, the tires crunching against the frozen earth as they plunged deeper into the forest. The boy's mind raced, his breath coming in short gasps as he glanced at his parents. They were eerily calm, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, their faces unreadable. He tried to make sense of what they had said. Asterisk, we've been waiting for you. Asterisk, what did that mean? Why had they left him alone all these years, only to show up now, in the middle of a cold, desolate night? Why was he suddenly the one who needed to know the truth? A shiver ran down his spine as the trees thickened around them, casting long shadows over the road. The boy strained his eyes, trying to make out the path ahead, but it was impossible. The headlights illuminated nothing but the darkness that swallowed everything else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car came to a stop. The boy blinked, his heart hammering in his chest, as his parents looked at him. "This is it," his father said quietly, turning off the engine. "This is where you find out who you really are." The boy's throat went dry. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother, still calm, but with an odd sense of urgency in her gaze, opened the door and stepped out. "Come on. You'll see for yourself." The boy hesitated, 1,000 questions swirling in his head, but there was something in their eyes, something that told him he had no choice. This was the moment. He had to go with them. He stepped out of the car and felt the cold air hit his skin, the biting chill making his hands tingle. The forest around him was eerily silent, save for the soft rustling of the trees. He felt the weight of the moment settle on him, an overwhelming sense of unease taking root deep in his gut. They led him through the dense woods, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The boy's heart raced as the silence grew thicker, the tension rising with each step. They didn't speak, and the more he walked, the more he realized how little he understood. Who were these people? Why had they abandoned him? Eventually, they reached a clearing in the forest. It was a strange sight. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood a dilapidated, old cabin. The windows were cracked, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow, but it had a strange allure to it, a pull that the boy couldn't explain. "This is where it all began," his father said, his voice low and distant. The boy's legs felt heavy as they crossed the threshold, and he could feel his breath catching in his chest. It wasn't just the cold. It was something else, an unspoken fear that he couldn't shake. Inside the cabin, the air was stale, the smell of wood and dust thick in the atmosphere. The place was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the back, where an old fireplace flickered with dim light. A table sat in the center of the room, papers scattered across it, along with old photographs and strange symbols. "What is this place?" the boy asked, his voice trembling slightly. "This is where we've been waiting for you," his mother repeated, her eyes hard now, no longer as comforting as they had been before. "This is where you'll understand the truth about your family." The boy stared at the photos on the table, his eyes narrowing. Some of them were old, faded, but others were recent. And the faces, some of them he recognized. He could see his own reflection in the photographs, but the faces of the other people seemed familiar, too. His heart pounded harder as he picked up a photo. It showed a young girl, standing next to an older woman, both smiling at the camera. The boy's mind raced. The girl looked like someone he knew, someone he had met in his dreams. "She's the one," the boy whispered, his voice cracking with realization. His mother looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Yes. You're starting to understand now. She's the one who will guide you, show you what you've been missing." The boy's mind was spinning. The pieces didn't fit. Who was she? and why did he feel so connected to her? As he stared at the photograph, a cold chill swept through the room, and the boy felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air grew heavier, and the sound of someone, moving through the shadows at the far end of the cabin reached his ears. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump. He spun around, heart racing, to find his parents standing motionless. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were staring at something, or someone, just beyond his reach. Before the boy could react, a figure stepped forward from the darkness. A tall man, dressed in a long, dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. His presence seemed to swallow the room, making the boy's breath catch in his throat. The stranger's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "You've come," the man's voice echoed, low and gravelly. "It's time." The boy froze, his blood running cold. Who was this man? What was he talking about? And why did he feel like he had just walked into a trap? His parents didn't move, but the tension in the room was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken words. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the man raised a hand, silencing him. "You've been living a lie, boy," the stranger said, his voice tinged with something dark. "Your family's secrets run deeper than you know." The boy's heart stopped. "What secrets?" The man took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "Your past isn't what you think. And you've been chosen to uncover the truth. Your journey is just beginning." The boy's head spun. His parents had brought him here, to this eerie place, and now this stranger was talking about secrets, about a journey. He felt the weight of his past, of everything he had been running from, finally crashing down on him. But before he could process everything, the man raised his hand again, and a strange, almost magnetic force surged through the room. The boy felt a pressure in his chest, a sensation of being pulled toward the man, but his legs wouldn't move. And then the man spoke one final time, his voice cold and final, "It's time for you to decide. Who are you really?" The boy's mind raced, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The boy stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as the strange man's words hung in the air. "Who are you really?" The question echoed in his mind, reverberating through every inch of his being. He glanced at his parents, but they remained silent, their eyes blank, as if they were no longer part of this world. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. The boy had spent his entire life longing for answers, and now that they were within his grasp, he was unsure whether he even wanted to know the truth. The man stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He extended a hand toward the boy, his expression unreadable. "Your past is tangled in shadows," the stranger said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "But you are the key to unraveling them. You've been chosen because you have the strength to face what others cannot." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. The man's words felt like a heavy burden settling on his shoulders. He had always wondered about his past, about the family he had never known, about why he had been abandoned. But now, in this strange cabin, with the weight of so many mysteries pressing down on him, he wasn't sure he was ready to face what lay ahead. "Why now?" the boy finally managed to ask, his voice shaky. "Why have you waited until now to tell me all this?" The man's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Because you were never ready until now. You had to come to this moment on your own. Everything you've done, every decision you've made, has led you here. You have a purpose, a destiny that is tied to the truth." The boy shook his head, trying to make sense of the words, but the more he tried, the more tangled everything seemed to become. He looked at his parents again, searching for some kind of reassurance, but they still didn't speak. It was as if they were no longer the people he had known, just shadows of their former selves. He turned back to the man, his resolve hardening. "I don't understand. Who are you?" What do you want from me? The stranger's expression didn't change. I am someone who has been watching over you, he said. I've been guiding you, pushing you to this point. And now, you must make a choice. Will you continue down the path that was chosen for you, or will you choose your own? The boy's mind raced. He thought of the snowman he had built all those years ago, of the endless days of solitude, of the quiet dreams of family that had kept him going. He thought of the girl in the photographs, the one he had seen in his dreams. Was she the key? Was she the answer to everything he had been searching for? As he stood there, torn between the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future, a memory flashed through his mind, a memory of his childhood, of a warm hand on his shoulder, of someone whispering words of encouragement, telling him to never give up. That voice, so familiar, so comforting. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he realized what it meant. His parents hadn't abandoned him. They had been trying to protect him, trying to keep him safe. They had known the truth all along, but they couldn't reveal it to him until he was ready. And now, after all this time, he finally understood. The boy took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he gathered his courage. He stepped forward, his eyes locking with the man's. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. I don't know what's ahead, but I'm ready to face it. For a moment, the stranger didn't move, his eyes studying the boy as if searching for something. Then, finally, he nodded. Very well, he said, his voice softer now. You've made your choice. The air in the room seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. The man turned to the table, and with a deliberate motion, he pushed the photos aside, revealing a thick, ancient-looking book. He opened it to a page, and the boy saw the same symbols that had been scattered across the table. This is your heritage, the man said. Everything you've been running from, everything you've been searching for, is contained here. But it's up to you to decide how to use it. The boy took a step forward, his fingers trembling as he reached for the book. As his hand touched the cover, a strange warmth spread through him, as if something deep inside him was awakening. He opened the book to the page the man had pointed to, and as he read the words, a sense of understanding flooded his mind. The truth wasn't just about his past, it was about his future, about who he was meant to become. He glanced up at his parents, who were now standing at his side, their eyes filled with something he had never seen before, hope. The boy felt a surge of emotion, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly belong. I'm not alone, he whispered to himself, the realization washing over him. He wasn't just part of a forgotten past. He was part of a legacy that had been waiting for him to discover it. And with that discovery came a responsibility to protect the truth, to honor the past, and to build a future that was his to shape. As the boy closed the book, the man stepped back, his expression approving. You have made the right choice. Your journey is just beginning. The boy nodded, his heart filled with a sense of peace he had never known before. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he was ready to face it. With his parents by his side, and the truth finally within his grasp, he knew that he wasn't just the abandoned boy anymore. He was someone stronger, someone who had the power to change his destiny. As the boy and his parents left the cabin and stepped back into the cold night, the snow continued to fall, but the weight of the world no longer pressed down on him. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to walk it. And as he looked up at the stars, he knew that no matter where his journey took him, he would never be alone again. Pulled toward the man, but his legs wouldn't move. And then the man spoke one final time, his voice cold and final, it's time for you to decide. Who are you really? The boy's mind raced, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The boy stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as the strange man's words hung in the air. Who are you really? The question echoed in his mind, reverberating through every inch of his being. He glanced at his parents, but they remained silent, their eyes blank, as if they were no longer part of this world. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. The boy had spent his entire life longing for answers, and now that they were within his grasp, he was unsure whether he even wanted to know the truth. The man stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He extended a hand toward the boy, his expression unreadable. "Your past is tangled in shadows," the stranger said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "But you are the key to unraveling them. You've been chosen because you have the strength to face what others cannot." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. The man's words felt like a heavy burden settling on his shoulders. He had always wondered about his past, about the family he had never known, about why he had been abandoned. But now, in this strange cabin, with the weight of so many mysteries pressing down on him, he wasn't sure he was ready to face what lay ahead. "Why now?" the boy finally managed to ask, his voice shaky. "Why have you waited until now to tell me all this?" The man's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Because you were never ready until now. You had to come to this moment on your own. Everything you've done, every decision you've made, has led you here. You have a purpose, a destiny that is tied to the truth." The boy shook his head, trying to make sense of the words, but the more he tried, the more tangled everything seemed to become. He looked at his parents again, searching for some kind of reassurance, but they still didn't speak. It was as if they were no longer the people he had known, just shadows of their former selves. He turned back to the man, his resolve hardening. "I don't understand. Who are you? What do you want from me?" The stranger's expression didn't change. "I am someone who has been watching over you," he said. "I've been guiding you, pushing you to this point. And now, you must make a choice. Will you continue down the path that was chosen for you, or will you choose your own?" The boy's mind raced. He thought of the snowman he had built all those years ago, of the endless days of solitude, of the quiet dreams of family that had kept him going. He thought of the girl in the photographs, the one he had seen in his dreams. Was she the key? Was she the answer to everything he had been searching for? As he stood there, torn between the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future, a memory flashed through his mind, a memory of his childhood, of a warm hand on his shoulder, of someone whispering words of encouragement, telling him to never give up. That voice, so familiar, so comforting. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he realized what it meant. His parents hadn't abandoned him. They had been trying to protect him, trying to keep him safe. They had known the truth all along, but they couldn't reveal it to him until he was ready. And now, after all this time, he finally understood. The boy took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he gathered his courage. He stepped forward, his eyes locking with the man's. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "I don't know what's ahead, but I'm ready to face it." For a moment, the stranger didn't move, his eyes studying the boy as if searching for something. Then, finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice softer now. "You've made your choice." The air in the room seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. The man turned to the table, and with a deliberate motion, he pushed the photos aside, revealing a thick, ancient-looking book. He opened it to a page, and the boy saw the same symbols that had been scattered across the table. "This is your heritage," the man said. "Everything you've been running from, everything you've been searching for, is contained here. But it's up to you to decide how to use it." The boy took a step forward, his fingers trembling as he reached for the book. As his hand touched the cover, a strange warmth spread through him, as if something deep inside him was awakening. He opened the book to the page the man had pointed to, and as he read the words, a sense of understanding flooded his mind. The truth wasn't just about his past, It was about his future, about who he was meant to become. He glanced up at his parents, who were now standing at his side, their eyes filled with something he had never seen before, hope. The boy felt a surge of emotion, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly belong. "I'm not alone," he whispered to himself, the realization washing over him. He wasn't just part of a forgotten past. He was part of a legacy that had been waiting for him to discover it. And with that discovery came a responsibility to protect the truth, to honor the past, and to build a future that was his to shape. As the boy closed the book, the man stepped back, his expression approving. "You have made the right choice. Your journey is just beginning." The boy nodded, his heart filled with a sense of peace he had never known before. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he was ready to face it. With his parents by his side, and the truth finally within his grasp, he knew that he wasn't just the abandoned boy anymore. He was someone stronger, someone who had the power to change his destiny. As the boy and his parents left the cabin and stepped back into the cold night, the snow continued to fall, but the weight of the world no longer pressed down on him. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to walk it. And as he looked up at the stars, he knew that no matter where his journey took him, he would never be alone again.